Oh hi! Didn't see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Vault. This is episode 5 entitled First Editions. Now for today's episode, I've selected a few titles from my book collection. These are all first edition and they range from fiction to non-fiction. So among some of the titles that we have today, the first one is The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. She is my favorite historian of all time. The second one is no less than the man himself, Winston Churchill, and his 6-volume history of the Second World War. I've just taken one because it's really heavy. And the third one is 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke, a fellow King's alumnus like myself. The fourth one is my favorite dystopian novel of all time, George Orwell's 1984. And lastly, the man himself, Lee Kuan Yew, and his battle for merger radio talks in 1961 and 1962. So before we go into each of the titles themselves, perhaps it would be good for us to learn a bit more about first editions and what they actually mean. Now, first edition or first printing, they are the most valuable and desirable edition of the title in the book. This edition, the author probably saw through production, and it was also closest in time to the actual writing itself. Now, this edition, because of all these qualities, gives us a glimpse into the author's original intent. Now, this first edition also has the ability to reflect the relationship between a book and its readers. This is the first time the readers are coming into contact with its content, and you can glean a lot from their reactions. On a broader scale, this first edition could also be a reflection of a particular moment in the life of a book, or a reflection of a significant time in which it is being published, and thereby able to reflect a bit more about the cultural movements and cultural waves that are happening at that point in time. Now, I guess one of the major questions that we have now is, how do we tell if it's a first edition? So similar to previous episodes, I scoured the web to find different criteria and indicators to determine if it is indeed a first edition. So the first thing, it's probably the obvious one, is to check the date and the publisher. With the advent of the internet, it's a lot easier to verify these kinds of information and the authenticity of the book itself. So the date and the publisher would be the first one. Second one, we've got to also check the labels, if there are first edition labels, or either in numeric terms first, like number 1 and ST, or first spelled out in full, FIRST, or it could be in a different phrasing, first printed as well. So that's possible. The third one, which is a relatively newer phenomenon that you can find on books as well, is the ISBN number. Now, this is pretty recent, and when I say recent, I mean like the 1970s. So from the 1970s onwards, you can check the ISBN number against a database. Before that, however, you would have to rely on other methods. And the fourth indicator, if there are quotes from critics, or if there are awards that are being published on the cover page itself, then it probably isn't a first edition, seeing that a first edition wouldn't have all those kinds of information available at that point in time anyway. So yeah, these are the 4 major ones that I managed to surface. There are many more, but these are the big ones. Alright, so let's get straight into the books themselves. Now, this first title over here is by author Barbara Tuchman, entitled The Guns of August. Now, this is a first edition published by the Macmillan Company in 1962 in New York. Now, this title is seminal in military history, in histories of the Great War. It won a Pulitzer Prize in 1963 for general nonfiction. Apparently, during the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, JFK was said to be reading this book during those 13 days. Now, this book itself traces the road to World War I. It examines the factors involved in that. It looks at the wider societal context of Europe at that point in time leading to the war. It looks at the plans, the strategies of the combatants. I really love Tuchman's writing. She really is a master of storytelling and the narrative, and I picked up a lot from her. My writing style actually was influenced and inspired a lot by her. Now, to me, history is the art of storytelling, and in that storytelling process, there should be that blend of fact evidence, but also imagination and romance. And I think Barbara Tuchman is someone who does that really, really well. And I would highly encourage you to read her titles if you haven't already done so. Alright, onward we shall go. Our next two titles, I've paired them up for a specific purpose which I will review later, but the two titles are 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke and The Battle for Merger, The Radio Talks by Lee Kuan Yew. By now, I think everyone knows that I am absolutely crazy over 2001: A Space Odyssey, whether it is the film by Stanley Kubrick or the book by Arthur C. Clarke. Now, this is a first edition of that book. It is published by Hutchinson and Co. Publishers in 1968. This is the first UK edition. This was written simultaneously with the production of Kubrick's film. So even though they share the same title, there are slight differences and there's a lot more exposition within Arthur C. Clarke's book compared to the film. Now, speaking of fanboys, this is the publication for The Battle for Merger, Radio Talks by Lee Kuan Yew. Now, the radio talks themselves, they were a series of 12 talks that were broadcasted by Lee Kuan Yew over Radio Singapore between 13 September 1961 and 9 October 1961. Now, even though they were 12 talks, they were broadcasted in 3 languages, English, Mandarin, and Malay. So that made it to be, quick math, 36 in total. And on top of that, there were translations in Hokkien and Cantonese as well. This publication itself, it was the compilation of all those talks and it was published a year later in 1962. Now, the intent of this series of talks was to urge the population towards merger, but also to repel a lot of the communist insurgency and the communist rhetoric at that point in time. This was a battle for the hearts and minds of Singaporeans and towards the Federation. A total of 10,000 copies of this first edition was produced. I'm not too sure how many survive now, but in 2014, they reprinted this, but this is the first edition. Now, the reason why I paired these two titles up is because of a peculiar phenomenon that you might see when you purchase second-hand books, and that is the names of the previous owners on the books themselves. So in the Battle for Merger book, you can see his name over there, and in 2001: A Space Odyssey, you can see his name as well. Now, interestingly enough, when I went to do some background research on who these people were, they are actually notable personalities. So for 2001, the previous owner, he's actually an academic in the literature and art scene. And for the previous owner of this Battle for Merger book, he was actually the chairman of the Brokers Association in Singapore. So pretty cool to see the transmission and the hereditary lineage of books going down different and random people, including myself. So the more perceptive of you might be thinking right now, hey, wouldn't that damage the value of the book? Well, you might be right. When I went to research into what determines the value of these first editions, things like its condition, scarcity, demand, these are the normal things that came up. If there are missing or damaged pages, that can severely affect the value of the book. Things that can add value to the book are if it is signed by the author, or if it is owned by a famous person, or it is specially bound or illustrated. Now, these are definitely owned by previous owners, but whether they constitute famous people and so on, and whether that adds value to these books, I am not too sure. But regardless, their names are there on the books. Now, the last title for today introduces another element to consider when determining the value of your first edition cover. Now, this is George Orwell's 1984. This particular edition is published by Harcourt, Brace and Company in 1949 in New York City. However, the original publisher for this particular title is another publisher called Secker and Wahlberg. So while this is a first edition, it is a first edition from Harcourt, Brace and Company and not from the original publisher of Secker and Wahlberg. Now, collectors will look at these kinds of things when they determine the value of the title, and it is something to consider when you are looking for your own first editions as well. So thank you for joining me on another episode of Vault. I know what you're thinking. Hey, what about the Churchill 6-volume history of the Second World War? Well, in today's outro, I'll be dedicating this segment to my brother Glenn, who wanted a shout out because he bought me this for my birthday many years ago, and he will never let me forget that. So here is a special outro to you, Glenn Ko Han Hui.